I've written a book called An Era of Darkness, where I look at the various claims that have been made for the benefits of the British Empire in India, and I have dispelled and debunked all of them. One of them we're going to talk about today is about the fact that the British gave us the railways. There were no benign or beneficial motives for the British East India Company when they started this. Way back in 1843, when trains had just been invented and were coming online in England, at that time, Lord Hardinge, who was the Governor-General of India for the East India Company, wrote a memo, remember 1843, saying that the railways would be, and I quote, beneficial for the commerce, government and military control of the country. 10 years later, 1853, his successor, Lord Dalhousie, said that the important role that India could play as a market for British goods and as a source for agricultural raw materials for Britain would be facilitated by the railways. So from the very top and from the very start, it was clear that the British wanted to build the railways for their purposes. I was criticized by some for arguing that the railways were actually a gigantic colonial scam. But they were. Why? Because when the railways were built, the British did so at the expense of Indians. Indian taxpayers paid for the entire construction of the Indian railways, but the profits were all made by the English. The government guaranteed 5%. If the profits ever dropped below 5%, they were guaranteeing 5% that the Indian taxpayer would pay for. Now, 5% may not seem very much today. In those days, it was the single most profitable investment available in the entire London Stock Exchange for 20 years. But it was described as private profit at public risk. The private profit was made by the Englishmen who were investing. The public risk was borne by the Indians. So 1 mile of railway in India cost £18,000, whereas in the same time, the same mile of railway in the United States cost only £2,000. So Indians were paying 9 times what they needed to pay to build the Indian railways, and that money entirely went to the English. The first railway line was opened between Bombay and Thane in 1853. Mahatma Gandhi's first crusade, when he returned to India in 1916, was on behalf of the third-class traveller. The third-class traveller paid a very high rate, in fact amongst the highest passenger fares in the world, for travelling in subhuman conditions, whereas the British trader paid the lowest freight rates in the world to ship freight on the Indian railways. Racism reigned in the railways right up to the First World War. The British in India insisted on hiring white people, Europeans, for pretty much every job in the railways except the most menial. From the directors of the railway board to the ticket collectors on the trains, it was all white people. When the policy was briefly relaxed, especially after the First World War, when a lot of white men were killed in the war and there weren't that many surplus going around for railway jobs in India, then continuing search for the most British-like Indian workers is what created the identification of the Anglo-Indian community with the railways, because the so-called Eurasians were brought in and asked to work in the railways, and when they ran out of Anglo-Indians, they then turned to the most European-looking they could find, the Parsis and then the Sikhs. But they were still never given jobs of any importance. The white people held on to them. Even when there was a brief attempt at Indianization in the 1870s, the British operated on the principle that it would take 3 Indians to do 1 European's job. But today there is a fitting end to the saga. What happened is that the British Railways now has a principal technology consultancy firm called Rendell Palmer and Triton. These people actually get most of their technical expertise on a consultancy contract basis with the Indian Railways consultancy arm RITES. So Indian engineers are now advising the British on how to run their railways, but after suffering for over 100 years, or about 100 years of British discrimination. The sad truth is there is a certain historical amnesia about the colonial experience. When this book came out, I read an article by a Pakistani journalist in London, whom I don't know personally, but she talked about raising 2 children in London in the best public school there, which is the best private school really, the way the British use the word, Westminster. And they majored in history, but they never read a line of colonial history. And I think that this kind of willingness to brush it under the carpet has to be confronted. It seems to me that we have to say to the people of Britain, ultimately, this is your history. You know that London has all these magnificent buildings. You ought to know what paid for them to be built there. You need to know what you did to so many countries around the world to finance your industrial revolution, build up your prosperity, and make you the big empire on which the sun never set, until, of course, India broke free in 1947. I have no problem with the Indian willingness to forgive and forget. But all I can say to all my fellow Indians is, by all means, let us forgive, but let us not forget. Memory and remembrance is very important. Let us know what our country went through for 200 years so we can be sure that it will never be repeated to us and to our people. In other words, let's forgive, but let's not forget. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.